Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Sachs, and really am delighted to be launching today the Foundations of Sustainable Development Practice. I hope everybody can see and hear. It's always a great thrill to be having this global classroom, and let me say hi to the people live present in the room, also our Columbia University students. I'm really happy with the start of the school year. I'm sorry to be a couple of minutes late, but it's the reason I'm late is actually the reason we're here, and that is that just as I was walking in, and I promise I was on time for the class, I got a call from one of the world-leading centers for disease control about the Ebola epidemic, and so I was taking a call about the emergency response right now. As everybody knows, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea are in the midst of a very fulminant epidemic of this Ebola virus, which in the field is incredibly lethal, perhaps 60% or more of infections in the field now ending in death. And I was talking to one of the world's most senior and seasoned public health officials who had just gotten back from a visit to the region this moment, and he said it's out of control. Things are spreading, the systems are being completely overwhelmed, bodies are not being buried, there is not a response capacity. There is not a network of information within the countries, and basic information about not touching infected people, exchanging fluids, handling the bodies for burial of people who have died in a safe manner. That's not yet in place. And in the meantime, what is also happening is that the epidemic is leading to almost a complete shutdown of air travel to the countries. Basic logistics, even UN personnel fighting the epidemic can't move around the region effectively. International Postal Service was suspended, mining operations, food planting disrupted. And so the economic calamity on top of the public health calamity threatens to be completely devastating as well. And the question is whether the international system can move and move quickly. Right now, governments don't have basic finance, organizational strategy, and so on. Why is this pertinent for us? Well, in obviously the most general sense, sustainable development is about human well-being, and health is one of the core pillars of human well-being and one of the core pillars of sustainable development. And in this sense, anything that is so threatening and disruptive locally and potentially globally as an emerging epidemic as this is part of our focus, and how to react is part of our mandate in this course. There is another element, though, that is absolutely pertinent for us, and that is that Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea are three of the poorest places in the world. It's not an accident that they can't handle this kind of epidemic. The public health system is largely non-existent in rural areas. For many of you who have worked in very poor countries, you'll know that in a lot of rural areas there may be a clinic 10 or 20 kilometers distant from the next. People don't have access. There may be no doctors around for populations of 50 or 100,000 or more people. Clinics are often simply padlocked. They don't have supplies. They don't have electricity. Many don't have running water, and so forth. because the public health systems don't have the resources. We've been working in the Earth Institute and in the Millennium Development Goal period, and now entering the Sustainable Development Goal period, to address this kind of calamity. It's, from every point of view, extraordinarily dangerous to leave people without access to primary health care. God forbid you may have an epidemic of exactly the kind we have. Or even without an epidemic, millions of kids die every year before the age of 5, under 5 years old, because basic primary health facilities and basic primary health care for malaria or diarrhea or respiratory infection is not available. So one of the goals for us as sustainable development practitioners is how to address such situation. And the positive side is a lot is known, and there's actually a lot of success in addressing the scale up of primary health systems in low income settings exactly like Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. But as part of our work also, we have to understand how the international system, such as it is, works. We call it the international community, but typically there's very little community in the international system. And I can tell you, just anecdotally, I have to view this pandemic out of a particular perspective, and that is that 1 year ago, I appealed to the heads of all of the major international health organizations to scale up community health worker outreach and access in Africa. And we launched a program that is headquartered at the Earth Institute called the 1 Million Community Health Worker Campaign. And this is based on work that we've done in the Millennium Villages with proven success of dramatically driving disease burdens and mortality rates down through the presence of usually high school educated villagers who take on a profession of health outreach within the communities. Well, when you launch an initiative like that, the typical response is a big thud. Why do we care? Why should we do that? And interestingly, when we made this appeal, a few countries came forward, one of which was Liberia. And with Liberia, we elaborated a detailed plan of scale up of community health workers. I could not get a penny for that for a year. Go to the Global Fund, sorry, they're at their quota. Go to Gavi, well, it doesn't fit this system. Go to the World Bank, well, very interesting, we'll see what can be done. And so nothing happened for a year. And then this epidemic has exploded. There is not the capacity in the local areas. There's no system for information dissemination, for contact tracing, for surveillance, for reporting, for provision of information. Not because it's beyond our imagining. Actually, the proposal was already there, not because of Ebola, but because one makes primary health systems. And yet, here we are. And when I spoke with President Johnson Sirleaf yesterday, we talked about how to get this urgently scaled up. So all of that is why I took the call a few minutes ago, because we operate in real time as sustainable development practitioners. The world doesn't wait, and even our academic timetables are always a little bit buffeted by world events. But we're here, and we have a very exciting program together over the next several weeks to better understand this international community, to understand the challenges of sustainable development, and for you to learn how to be practitioners that are effective in this. Sustainable development is a body of knowledge backed by practical know-how. And many of you have some experience in the field already. You've worked in NGOs, or you have worked in...
This is Xinhua.
Oh, good.
Can't join.
Worked in NGOs, or worked in international organizations. But we're here to help you gain more experience, to become more knowledgeable, better practitioners. For those of you in the MDP program, you'll have practical training between the first and the second year that will put you into the field, in the villages, in many parts of the world, working on exactly these problems. And I want you to learn the concepts, the science, the experience, the best practices, the management skills, and the advocacy to learn how to be a pain in the neck on behalf of sustainable development. Because a lot of this is learning how to speak out, how to organize responses, how to make systems that don't move very well move better. And that is the essence of why we're here. So maybe just a few words about sustainable development to get us started. You've watched, I hope, Lecture 1 of the Age of Sustainable Development, and I'll just want to emphasize a few points, and then I know we have discussion time, and that's what really counts. So what is sustainable development? Sustainable development is both a way of analyzing how human systems work, and a way of approaching social problem solving. And in both cases, sustainable development is a systems approach. It says that things we care about are the outcomes of complex, interconnected processes. And from an analytical point of view, we want to understand those processes. For example, how does an emerging disease like Ebola break out? What are the dynamics of an epidemic? What are the mechanisms of epidemic control? This involves biological systems, obviously. In the case of Ebola, for example, a transfer of a virus from an animal reservoir, perhaps a chimpanzee, perhaps bats, nobody knows with this particular outbreak, to a human population. That's biology, the basic dynamics of infection. And it's also human systems. How does a public health system work? How does it work in a low-income setting? And how can one design the system to work more effectively? So that's the analytical side of sustainable development. And the focus is on at least 4 systems. One is the natural systems of climate and disease transmission, pathogen dynamics, food production, biodiversity, natural hazards, and so forth. A lot of physical Earth system science, both biological and climatological. Second is the economic system. What we produce, use, trade, earn, and of course, since economies are grounded in physical Earth systems, how the physical Earth systems of climatology affect the human systems of food production. The third is social systems, and by that I mean the dynamics of communities, the dynamics of sociological categories like identity, religion, intercommunal fighting and violence, trust in communities, family formation and stability. So the areas that generally are under sociological concern, and when they break down, the economic systems also break down. And the fourth system that I would say we focus a lot on is governance. Political power, force, law, which is all part of traditionally political science, but we're interested in the interaction of governance, economy, society, and the physical systems. So from an analytical point of view, sustainable development is the study of these four interacting systems. It's a lot of work. I think it's about the most interesting intellectual exercise because you're not allowed to say, I don't care about X, Y, or Z. Everything is interconnected. And trying to understand those interconnections is paramount for this field. Now, there's a second aspect of sustainable development, which is the so-called normative side. Normative is the word we use to mean based on norms or ethical standards or human goals. Normative is in distinction to positive in the way that it's used in the social sciences, at least, and in philosophy. Positive means descriptions of how things are. Normative means how things should be. And sustainable development is also a normative idea that societies should pay attention to a range of goals that include economic, social, governance, and environmental objectives. So take those four systems and think about the goals for them. What are the goals for economy? Well, that would include presumably widespread prosperity, ending extreme poverty, helping countries make material progress to alleviate conditions of hunger or deprivation, and letting people have more enjoyable, prosperous lives, more leisure, more chance for education, and so on. What would be social goals? Societal goals might be making sure that inequalities do not extend to such a degree that people are unable to achieve dignity, security, basic material needs, and a chance for their own progress. Also, social goals would presumably include trust, peace within the community, family stability, which is something, by the way, that is ripped apart when migrant workers leave their families and children don't see their parents for years on end, and that is a phenomenon of hundreds of millions of kids around the world. Sometimes cheered on how great it is remittances are, but the flip side of it is a massive dislocation of communities. A third kind of goal on governance is that governments are not abusive, that they follow rule of law, that they're transparent, that they treat citizens equally, and that corruption is kept to a tolerable low level. And this is something that is fulfilled by very, very few places in the world. Maybe Sweden and Denmark, but I don't know of too many others, certainly not the United States anymore, where corruption is absolutely massive and pervasive. But we legalize it. It's just called campaign contributions, but it comes to the same thing. And so faith in government, legitimacy of governance, parliamentary institutions like the U.S. Congress having an approval rating of higher than 10%, which would be nice, but doesn't happen now because the public is disgusted in this country with its governance, and this is true in most parts of the world. I think governments don't behave themselves very well. And then the fourth objective is environmental, and this is probably the unique feature of our time. All of the problems of poverty, of social inequality, of bad governance have been with humanity for uh, at least since the beginning of the Neolithic era 10,000 years ago, and probably on many fronts in quite powerful ways since the Industrial Revolution began 200 years ago. But what is quite special for our time and makes sustainable development as a normative idea even more urgent than ever before is the environmental crisis, and the idea that one of our goals is to preserve the functioning of Earth's ecosystems, both as a goal in and of itself, as an ethical idea of human responsibility to other species and to the planet in which we are stewards, of which we are stewards, inadvertently so. Why one species should be stewards of the whole planet is an oddity, but it happened. And second, from an intergenerational point of view, we are in the process of wrecking the planet. And my generation has gone quite far in wrecking the planet for yours. And unless you shift course, you will absolutely ruin the planet for your children's generation, because we're on that course. And it's happened that we've reached that time just now. And a lot of what we're going to study is what have been called the planetary boundaries. The fact that the Earth has now filled up to such an extent, 7.2 billion people now on the planet, compared to fewer than 1 billion people at the start of the Industrial Revolution around the year 1800. So a nearly 10-time increase of population since industrialization began, and a level of resource use per person that is at least a factor 10 higher than in 1800, and arguably 2 factors of 10, 100 times greater than at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So in my own thinking, I date everything from 1800 till now, because before 1800, the world was basically rural, poor, and slow changing. And after 1800, everything dramatically accelerated with the fossil fuel era, with the steam engine, with automobiles, with the oil age, with natural gas, with the age of electricity, with all of the technological advances of the 20th century and now the 21st century. So I'll constantly refer to this 200-year remarkable, unique phase of history. But what it means is that the size of the world economy, which we measure as the sum of the gross domestic products of all of the world's countries, where gross domestic product signifies how much is produced per year in each geography of the world, and then you add it up and you get the gross world product, that has increased by factor 300 maybe since the Industrial Revolution. All these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt, because how can you compare an economy that had no cars, no computers, no mobile phones, no use of electricity with today's economy and give a number of increase? But economists try, and they come up with something like a 300-time increase of scale of world output. Now, the one thing we do know in the period is that Earth itself didn't increase at all in its ecosystem functions, in the size of the atmosphere, in the size of land mass, and so forth. So there is a basic dynamic of a growing world population and a growing world economy and growing resource use against a finite planet. That by itself doesn't necessarily prove anything, and that was happening gradually for millennia beforehand. But what has changed is that because of scale effects of this huge world output, which now is about $100 trillion per year, to give you a number, that is adding up the outputs of all 193 countries of the UN and giving the gross world product. And 100 trillion divided by 7.2 billion is an average output per person of roughly maybe $12,000 to $14,000 per person. At that scale of economic activity, the impacts that humanity is having on the physical environment are completely unprecedented. And when you factor in that population is continuing to increase by roughly 75 million people per year net, births minus deaths being an increment roughly of 75 million per year, so that every 13, 14 years it's an extra billion people on the planet. That's very fast. And we reached 7 billion people, according to the UN's population clock, on October 31st, 2011, Halloween night, 2011, the 7 billionth person joined the planet by the ticker of the UN Population Division. And by 2024, that will reach about 8 billion people. And by 2040 or so, 9 billion on the current fertility trajectory. And output per person is rising in the world economy as well because of better technologies, more powerful technologies, better ways to drill for oil, to produce natural gas, to frack gas, for example, or to discover new resources, or to cut down more trees, or to fish more fisheries in the ocean. So the resource use per person is also rising. That means the world output, this gross world product, is also increasing at a rate of maybe 3 to 4 percentage points per year. I want you always to use the rule of 70 in your mind, which is the idea that if you want to know how long it takes for something to double that is undergoing geometric growth, constant proportionate growth, divide 70 by the growth rate, and that tells you the doubling period. So it's quite handy that if the world economy is growing at 4% per year, you would say 70 divided by 4 is 17 and a half years would be the time for the world economy to double from its roughly $100 trillion today to roughly $200 trillion about 18 years from now. So keep the rule of 70 in your head for the rest of your lives, because lots of things have geometric growth, including the world economy. But the point is, to come back to sustainable development, we face this environmental challenge that is absolutely extraordinary. This huge world population, massive resource use, finite planet, and a continuing growth of resource use that roughly scales with the size of the world economy, which is roughly doubling every 18 to 20 years against the finite planet. And so the goal of figuring out how the heck we can maintain economic objectives, social stability, good governance, and not wreck the planet at the same time is a unique challenge of your generation. It was hinted at a generation ago, or was I would say, known a generation ago and first realized 2 generations ago. In fact, one could date these things. In 1972, the world had its first environmental summit in Stockholm. And then in 1992, the world had its second major environmental summit in Rio at what was called the Earth Summit. And then in 2012, the world met a third time, and when I say the world, I mean the government officials and NGOs in Rio again at what was called the Rio +20 Summit. Now what's interesting is 2 generations ago, back in Stockholm, the world was given a warning. Combining economics and environmental sustainability is going to be a very hard task. And I was a freshman in college that year in 1972, way back in another century. And the first book that I was assigned in my introductory economics class was Limits to Growth. How many people here have heard of the book? One, okay. It was an incredibly influential, quite famous book of its day, because it was the first study that said we've got a problem of a growing world economy against a finite planet, and this could lead to a kind of environmental overshoot and eventually an economic and environmental collapse. That was 1972. Then in 1992, when governments came together at the Rio Earth Summit, they adopted the idea of sustainable development. It was 20 years now of warning. And they said, okay, we've got a big problem. Growth of the world economy, ecosystems under stress, and they recognized three major environmental problems: climate change, loss of biodiversity, and desertification, land turning into desert, which doesn't mean necessarily land turning into sand dunes. What it means is land being degraded in dryland areas to the point where it's no longer productive for farming or for pasture lands or for other ecosystem services. So it's land degradation in dry areas. And those were the three major crises that the Rio Earth Summit took up. And the Rio Earth Summit adopted three big treaties that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. One is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the second is called the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and the third is the Convention on Biological Diversity. These are three terrific treaties, by the way, in that they state the principle of sustainable development, that economics should coincide with environmental sustainability. In other words, the normative idea of sustainable development. And these treaties were adopted with great fanfare back in 1992, and they were ratified, and President George H.W. Bush Sr., the first of the two Bush presidents in the United States, went to the Rio Earth Summit and signed these treaties. And we look back at the Rio Earth Summit as the high watermark of consensus in the world on environment, because all the world said, let's do something. Now, 20 years on, when the governments again met in Rio at the Rio +20 summit in June 2012, the feeling was grim, because 20 years on, the world economy had soared, especially China's remarkable economic growth, but the three treaties had not been put effectively into practice. There was massive human-induced climate change underway, as there is, and the fancy term, which you will all use here on in all the time, is anthropogenic climate change. Anthropos meaning human, and genic meaning caused. So human-caused climate change, anthropogenic climate change. There was massive desertification in many parts of the world, tremendous land degradation, tremendous crises in many dryland regions, and there is what's called the sixth great extinction underway, where human action of deforestation, pollution, water diversion, climate change is causing millions of species to be pushed to the edge or beyond the edge of survival. And this could be calamitous from the point of view of global biodiversity. And so at Rio +20, the soundings were very bad, and this is where you come into the story, obviously, because it's now been, you're the third generation of sustainable development. The first one was the glimmer, the warning. The second one was the adoption of the concept, and now the realization we don't have it. We are not on track. We're on track of massive crises. And by the way, massive crises uniquely or unprecedentedly on environment, but also massive crises like Ebola, like extreme poverty being unaddressed, like growing inequality of income, like tremendous sectarian violence spreading like wildfire also in the Middle East, across North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and many, many other places. And I wrote an article today for Project Syndicate, which you can look up, which says that the U.S. is one of the constant provokers of this kind of violence, that we should pull back from the Middle East because we create more unrest than we solve every time we try to overthrow a new government, and so on. So here we are. Sustainable development is a goal, but it's not being achieved. And that's why I believe that it's right to say the age of sustainable development, not fully in an ironic sense, but in two senses. One is that the need for an integrated framework, both to understand and to direct our activities, is more vital than ever. And second, the prioritization of this idea from an action point of view needs to be put in place. So I don't really know whether, looking back, this will be the age of sustainable development or the age of sustainable development neglect. But if it is the latter, it'll be catastrophic. And that's why I think it's really exciting that we're here to brainstorm on how we can understand the challenges and how we can address the challenges. And I also think you're privileged, all of you, here in this classroom and around the world, that you have an opportunity to be leaders in this, because this is really the big one, and not too many people have the training, position, and opportunity to play a kind of leadership role. But our hope is that you will, and that you will take that on, and that this course will help to empower you to do that. Now, in June 2012, the governments not only did a bit of hand-wringing and some recognition that these treaties had failed so far, but they also adopted a document which is on your reading list called The Future We Want, which was a forward-looking document that reasserted the goal of sustainable development, that defined the goal as integrating economic, social, and environmental objectives, and then implicitly based on good governance, but it's a little bit vague about whether it's really 4 dimensions or 3 dimensions of sustainable development. And then something very important for us and very timely. The government said in order to make a breakthrough to actual achievement of sustainable development, we should adopt some clear goals. And this is a fundamental theme for us in our work in this class and in the Masters of Development Practice, the idea of goal-based development, and in particular sustainable development goal-based development. So this Rio Plus 20 Summit came up with the concept of Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as a normative framework, as an expression of intention of what the world should aim for during the next generation. And one of the motivations for the SDGs is the relative success of the MDGs. So in the year 2000, at the start of the new millennium, the UN member states adopted Millennium Development Goals that were put on the table by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. And these MDGs, the 8 of them, focused on fighting extreme poverty, income poverty, hunger, children out of school, diseases running rampant, lack of access to safe water and sanitation, discrimination against girls and women. And they became the normative framework for global cooperative action between 2000 and 2015. They weren't sustainable development goals because they focused mainly on the challenge of extreme poverty. They also weren't treaties. They weren't ratified by the US Senate. They are not international law. They're an expression of aspiration. And the idea is that by having these goals, they can give an impetus to action. They can spur cooperative activities, name and shame for countries that don't try to meet the goals, direction of effort towards common objectives, defining of standards, unity of reporting systems, and so forth, all in the interests of accelerating progress. And the MDGs made a lot of progress. They did not produce all that one wanted out of them, in the sense that many poor countries will not achieve some, and a few countries, none of the MDGs. But what's pretty clear is that the MDGs help to spur more attention, more action, and so on. Not entirely satisfactorily, just like the story of Liberian community health workers that I started with. Not everything is getting done that needs to get done, but at least there's some more direction. So in June 2012, the member states, focusing on the relative failures of the treaties of sustainable development, said, let's take a feather from the cap of the MDGs and try to use the public awareness of shared goals to motivate action. They called for SDGs. There's a quotation that I very much like of President John F. Kennedy, and as you get to know me, you will know that I quote President John F. Kennedy a lot because I think he was a great leader, and he had a wonderful way with words also. And he said when he was pursuing the goal of a peace treaty with the Soviet Union in 1963, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And I really like that idea. Define the goal more clearly, make it seem more manageable and less remote by showing how can you actually achieve the goal practically. And by doing so, you help people to see it, to understand it, to draw hope from it, and to move towards it. So that is more or less my philosophy towards the MDGs and the SDGs, which is that goal-based development is a good idea. It's a real motivator. It makes us think. If we say we want to reduce child mortality by 2/3 by such and such date, you're given a target. And then if experts show this can be done and here's what to do, then you can also motivate coordinated action and help people move irresistibly toward the goals. So that's the motivating philosophy, I believe, of these SDGs. Now we're meeting at a very interesting time for the SDGs, because when they were announced in 2012, the UN General Assembly was assigned the task of coming up with these goals. And the timetable was basically to pass the baton from the MDGs to the SDGs at the end of 2015. And so the MDG period, when they were adopted in September 2000, was to last till end of 2015. We're obviously just at the last year of that now. And then the SDGs will be the next set of global goals from January 1, 2016 onward, presumably to the year 2030. And so when the UN announces that the next set will start on such and such date, you can be sure that the negotiators will use every second of talking until that moment to agree, because that's also part of the philosophy, which is negotiate till the last moment, till the final curtain. And that means that there has now been 2 years of negotiation on what these SDGs should be, and 1 more year to go. So the SDGs are supposed to be adopted in September 2015. During this past 2 years, the UN General Assembly appointed a large open working group of dozens of governments to consider what should be SDGs for the period 2016 onward. And that open working group issued a report last month, and I hope it's on the reading list, but if it isn't, it will be. And you'll find that there are 17 listed priorities. And I believe that those 17, through the artful use of commas and semicolons and other choice words, will come down to around 10 by the end of the process, so that because 17 is too large to memorize, but 10 is probably manageable, and I think we're on track to have 10 or so sustainable development goals. And we're going to study week by week those topics: health, education, conserving biodiversity, averting climate change disaster. How do you actually define a goal, quantify a target, make such a goal, which is huge and dreamy, one could say, or idealistic, be actually a practicable, achievable goal, so that people draw hope from it and move irresistibly toward it. And that really is our objective in this course. It is to understand the practical challenges of sustainable development through the idea of goal-based development. Now, we actually have a full diplomatic agenda coming up in the following year, because it turns out that not only will the SDGs, if we're lucky, be adopted in September 2015, but the whole package of creating what's also called the post-2015 development agenda for the world will be put into shape. And there will be actually 3 big treaties in 2015, or not treaties, sorry, 3 big summits of all of the UN member states that will take place. In July next year, there will be a summit on financing for sustainable development. This means all of the financial flows, including development assistance and private capital markets, that need to play a role to help fund the investments to achieve sustainable development. And as all of you know, there are endless debates about how development aid should be part of the story, how market capital can be part of the story, and so forth. So that's summit number 1. Then summit number 2 is in September 2015. That is to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. Then summit number 3 is in Paris in December 2015 under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because the world still, 22 years after signing the UNFCCC does not yet have an operational approach to heading off anthropogenic climate change. And so we're on a very dangerous path, and there were big hopes back in 1997 that the so-called Kyoto Protocol would give a framework for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that cause anthropogenic climate change. That didn't happen for a lot of reasons we'll discuss. Then, 12 years on, there were very big hopes when the world met in Copenhagen in COP 15. COP means Conference of the Parties. So it's the 15th big meeting of the signatories to the Framework Convention. That took place in Copenhagen, and all the expectations were that a big agreement would be signed to replace the Kyoto Protocol. And because President Obama was newly elected, the world was filled with hope that he was going to come in and here's the treaty and everything was going to be signed and we were going to get on our way. That, of course, didn't come close to happening. It turned into a kind of debacle where the world leaders were huddling in the last couple of hours, and President Obama said, I got to catch my plane, and he was out of there, and the whole thing ended without an agreement. So in the next meeting, COP 16, which was in Cancun, the world leaders said, well, it wasn't leaders then, it was their deputies, said, we better agree, and let's agree that we'll agree by 2015. Not just that, by the way, you've really got to understand the urgency of it. In 2010, they said, we'll agree by 2015 to put in place a treaty that will go into force by 2018 to start operationally 2020. That's the timeline we're on, actually. In the meantime, we're putting up 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions from each year from fossil fuel use, and so we have basically a growing disaster. But all eyes are on Paris 2015 as the third of these big summits next year, where the idea is that we're supposed to face the challenge of cutting sharply the greenhouse gas emissions. This is not easy to do. Anthropogenic climate change is caused by human economic activity that leads to emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and a few other industrial gases into the atmosphere. And the biggest of those, most consequential, is carbon dioxide. And the biggest reason for the carbon dioxide emissions is burning of coal, oil, and gas. We burn coal, oil, and gas because that's how we run our economies. And if we didn't, these lights wouldn't be on, this computer wouldn't be working, the taxi that I grabbed at the last minute to get here would not be running, and basically we would be at subsistence, not unlike the poor rural villagers in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea fighting the Ebola epidemic right now, and who don't have access to electricity also. So this problem of climate change is very complicated because we want our energy system, which we really like, because it creates the kind of modern economy that keeps us alive and keeps us prosperous in the lucky countries. And yet it's causing this devastating set of side effects of human-induced climate change because of the so-called greenhouse gas effect, of which the main human-induced greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide from our energy use. So we have to change the energy system. No problem, right? We have to move from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar power, geothermal energy, much greater energy efficiency, and depending on your taste, nuclear power, or carbon capture and sequestration, or biofuels, or other potential technologies that don't emit carbon dioxide. And obviously the world has not agreed on a strategy like that. So here we are, lucky to be studying this issue together just as sustainable development goals are being adopted, and just as the world is going to enter the most intense period of diplomacy on sustainable development, certainly since 1992, but I would argue ever, because all the pieces are coming together on the financing, on the goal setting, on the climate change, and at a time of enormous urgency. And we're also very lucky that our colleagues, many of whom will be lecturing in this class, are quite deeply involved in all of this global negotiation, and also on the ground in trying to demonstrate how practical approaches can be taken. The Earth Institute, which is home to the Secretariat of the Masters of Development Practice, is also home to a world university network, and most of the universities online are part of that network, called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN. A lot of what you're going to read is materials of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is a network of problem solving that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked me to help him to organize just after the Rio Plus 20 summit. So back in August 2012, he asked me to help set up a worldwide network of universities to be able to take practical analysis and early stage implementation and support for governments around these sustainable development goals. And we set up the Secretariat here. We made the MDP curriculum a kind of core of the whole SDSN effort. We are putting online and in the global classroom as much information as we can to be available for the world community. And for those of us in New York, and we welcome all of you to come visit us who are joining by video conferencing, we have the UN down the block, just a few miles from here, and we're very actively involved at a diplomatic level with this process right now of trying to find how to make the goals congenial for the whole world, how to create a financing environment, and how to solve this very complicated challenge of doing all of this while shifting the core energy system of the world economy in quick order, real time, literally as the plane is flying. So this is a lot of work, but you're going to see close up what all of this is about. So that, I hope, is a helpful introduction to why we're here, to what sustainable development is, to how we fit into the global timetable and global processes right now, how our course is situated within the context of global diplomacy, and with some hints about your responsibility, all of the students in this class. You're going to be the ones with the training, with the knowledge, with the experience to help lead the solution. So the goals may be set as you're completing this program, but then the implementation begins. Work hard, study hard, learn from the foundations course, and you'll be well equipped to help lead the process in the coming years. Thanks a lot for joining the first lecture, and do enjoy the online materials. We're going to have plenty of chance for me individually also to participate in discussions with you. Even aside from the global classroom, I'll be doing a number of Google Hangouts where we can have hundreds or thousands of people online, and we can have discussion about each of these points. I also would like people to follow me on Twitter, because I'm using Twitter day by day as something happens at the UN or as some news of the epidemic and so forth. So I'm at Jeff D. Sachs, at Twitter and hashtag #SUSDev, and that will give you kind of give us a chance to have an open daily chat about developments, and the Google Hangouts will give us the chance to have a discussion. I know I didn't get to the questions today. There were questions. We're going to do more Q&A in the future, but I wanted to set the stage this morning, and I won't do questions today. We'll conclude today's lecture now. A number of you are going into your own classroom discussions at this point. Some of you, I presume, had those discussions beforehand, and I know that we all look forward to being together with you next week and more chance for a discussion in the coming weeks. So thanks very much, and we'll be together in a week's time.